and South Delta. The second phase is the Delta Comprehensive Review, also called Phase 2. Just a quick bit of background. On May 16th, we had a scoping session for Phase 2 of the Bay Delta process. On April 24th, we sent out a save the date notice to our LIRIS list dealing with the 4 possible workshops that we're discussing today. We also, in that notice, asked folks that if they were interested in providing input, that they let us know via a special email address, and so we did keep track of that. On June 1st, we had a coordination meeting with those folks that expressed interest in coordinating these workshops, and we had probably 30 or 40 people attend that, and we had quite a few comments that were very interesting. On June 15th, which is just last Friday, we sent out to the LIRIS list and all those folks that attended the email or attended the workshop or the coordination meeting, I'm sorry, we sent out a possible formats and questions to these folks, and we had a proposal for a format, we had an alternative, and then we had a set of questions that we're recommending be asked. And in brief, the way the proposal is set up is that we would have an expert panel organized by the lead scientist of the Delta Science Program. That would be Dr. Peter Goodwin. But in addition to that, we would have 2 other panels, a water users panel that would actually be coordinated and organized by our facilitator, Brock Bernstein, who has agreed to take on that role. And then the second panel would be a non-governmental organizational panel also put together by Dr. Bernstein. Just a couple other things. We would, of course, request materials be submitted in advance, at least 2 weeks in advance. And then we would have a session or a time for open public questions and comments at the end of the workshop. The last item is our recommendation is that our proposed format is that we have a summary report that Dr. Bernstein would prepare summarizing the workshops and also identifying the points of agreement, points of disagreement, sources of disagreement, and areas of uncertainty. That way we would have everything in one package to help inform us through this process. One note is that because of the time it may take to put together the Delta Science Program Lead Scientist panel, there may be some delay depending on how fast we can get that together. So we just wanted to throw in that caveat. And then the alternate format that we listed in the document that we sent out last Friday essentially is very similar to what I just mentioned. The difference is that we would have 6 panels instead of the 3 panels that I just mentioned. So the 6 panels would be state and federal regulatory agencies and fisheries agencies, the state and federal resource management agencies is number 2. We'd also have the environmental groups and the NGOs. We would have in-delta water suppliers as a 4th one. The 5th one would be the State Water Project, Central Valley Project contractors, and then finally the Sacramento Valley water suppliers. Of course, it is possible to have some sort of bifurcation of this, have something in the middle as an alternative, and there has been suggestions that if that's the case, that there be maybe some sort of in addition to the proposed format, we have an upstream in-basin exporters panel, and then just have a state and federal fishery panel. The last item is, the last part of this is just the questions we had. As I mentioned, we had included a set of questions that we think would be relevant to these workshops that we would ask the participants to address. And in essence, in brief, what it is that we would ask them to inform us of changes or new information that's available since the 2009 periodic review for the Bay Delta. And since the 2010 report on the development of the flow criteria for the Delta ecosystem. So with that, I'll stop there. I don't know, Diane, if you had anything else you wanted to add.
So, Rich, what you're saying on question number 1 on the proposed questions isn't getting into detail of either the 2009 periodic review or the 2010 flow report, but to concentrate on information that is new since that period of time. Is that correct?
Right, and how that information in combination with the information that's referenced in the 2009 periodic review staff report and the Delta flow criteria report should inform changes to the Bay Delta plan. And what additional information, for instance, with the, with the Delta flow criteria report, we didn't look at the need for cold water pool resources, and we didn't look at other beneficial uses and those types of issues. So in addition to new information that wasn't included in those other 2 reports.
Okay. One, and I don't know who's appropriate to answer this question, anyone, probably, but when I attended the June 1st meeting, which was very informative to me, I came away from it with a question that I still have, and that is, we want to provide an opportunity for all of the concerned parties to have an opportunity to articulate their new information and to express themselves. When I look at the list, some people have a much narrower area for concern, if you will, and I just use the example of in-Delta water suppliers. I mean, they're important to hear from, but certainly their issue isn't quite as broad as that of others. So how, in a short period of time, do we provide an equitable amount of time for somebody to express themselves without saying, you're all in the same slot, you've all got X number of minutes, and I hope you use it wisely? I mean, is there a way to deal with that? I'm struggling with it, and I need someone's counsel here. Anyone?
I think that's the quandary that we've been dealing with also, is trying, in the Delta flow criteria proceeding, we had various interests up here, and we had some panels with 20 different members on it, and we were trying to avoid a process where we had that many participants, and we had a lot of reiteration of information, though we asked people not necessarily to do that. So trying to find some kind of middle ground where you'd have a focused conversation with the divergent viewpoints on the different issues. As Rich mentioned, the format that we're proposing includes public comments. In addition, there's the opportunity to submit written materials before the proceeding, which is, many times more valuable to staff when referencing information. We'd like to know, what the scientific papers are and have those submitted and the page numbers, et cetera. So there are those 2 opportunities. We're open to suggestions for how we could improve our proposal as well.
As we go forward, anyone that, clearly we're struggling with being fair here, not that we don't want to be fair, but any suggestions I would appreciate as we go forward. So thank you. Is that it?
Yeah, now we can turn it over to public comments on the item.
Mr. Rubin.
Good afternoon, Chair Hoppen, members of the board, Mr. Moore particularly. Pleasure to be before you. There's a lot of positives in the document that the staff prepared. Initially, and I apologize, I'm here before speaking for the San Luis and Delta Mendota Water Authority. There's a lot of positives that the authority sees, starting with just having the workshops is an important first step. Requiring written submittals ahead of the workshops, having a facilitator try to distill information is very critical. But there are some significant concerns that the authority has as well. And I thought it was interesting, the discussion on the previous agenda item and board member Spivey Weber's comments about making sure that you start a very important process with a good foundation. And and that rang a very strong bell in my mind. I had a strong reaction to the document that the staff provided, and the reaction was strong in my mind because we are dealing with important issues. It is important to set a very stable foundation for this process. And also, there was a lot of lessons that I've learned participating in prior workshops, particularly dealing with the Bay Delta, the complexity of issues, and frankly, I think some of the divisiveness that was created in the workshops. And I have that in mind in terms of presenting my comments today, looking at establishing a strong foundation and a process that may help distill a lot of complex issues and bring together rather than bring, cause people to go apart in this process. First, in terms of the formats, we do prefer the second, the alternative format. We believe that it is important to hear from all stakeholders. The panels that are identified in the first, the proposed format is too narrow. And frankly, as we talked to your staff on June 1st about, we are skeptical on the benefits of an expert panel. I assume what staff means by an expert panel is an independent expert panel. It's unclear what that means. A lot of people have preconceived notions coming into this, whether they're with a university or otherwise, and it will be, I think, very challenging to find a truly independent panel. Also, this process will be peer-reviewed. It's a requirement, and so I question the utility of taking time away from stakeholders, your ability to hear from stakeholders, to hear from a panel that...
John, can I comment on that? I'll give you my...
Don't have to ask me permission.
Well, no, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I want to give you my opinion. I mean, this panel, to me, will have an expertise, just like you'll have an expertise, and David Elijah will have an expertise. You know, it would not be my intention, unless I hear different from everyone else who I would disagree with, that this panel would be a peer review type group that would critique what everyone else has to say. I mean, I would see them as being experts in their field, just like you're an expert in your field. They'll give their opinion, and that will be the weight. If that's, you know, if anyone disagrees with that, they
certainly
can
agree.
comment on it, but that would be my opinion.
Yeah, I don't have strong opinions on this. Again, my two concerns is if they're coming in intended to be an independent panel, then
I think they have scientific expertise. They're going to probably have a certain bias. You might even have a little certain bias. I don't know. And one's going to hold. You know, we're going to take that into consideration when we listen to them. Somebody's credentials, in my opinion, aren't going to be any more stellar than someone else's.
and the valid points. The other concern that I've expressed is just whether by bringing in yet another panel you're taking time from stakeholders, and if you could fit the time in, then so be it. But let me turn to two additional points in terms of the format before I hopefully have some time to talk about the questions themselves. First, oral presentations. I think it is important for the board to emphasize in the notice that oral presentations should be focused initially on a brief summary of written material, but then turn and majority of time to be talking about areas where participants agree with what was submitted by others or disagree, and the basis for any disagreements or uncertainties is associated with the science. And second, the facilitator's role. We are encouraged by the facilitator issuing a draft report that allows for public comment. We would like to see an intermediate step that once the facilitator prepares a draft report, that the facilitator convene the technical experts that participated in the panel discussions to talk about the draft report, to see if the facilitator has properly identified areas of agreement, disagreement, bases for disagreement, and uncertainty. So with that, let me turn to the questions, because frankly, I think that's where I do have much greater heartburn, much greater concerns. The questions that have been presented by staff, I think, frankly, are broad enough that they allow for stakeholders to present any and all relevant information. My concern is that the questions do not provide sufficient structure for submittals. I think the structure would benefit the process. It will allow for information to be presented possibly in a similar fashion, may allow for a lot of the complicated issues to be presented in a way that are, better lend themselves for identification of areas of agreement, disagreement, uncertainty. Second, I think they overemphasize the 2009 and 2010 reports, the 2009 report, periodic review report, and 2010 flow criteria report. Clearly, there's important information in those reports, but I don't think that they should be the basis upon which material is presented, or the focus of material that's presented. And I turn to specifically the 2010 flow criteria report and the cautionary note that the State Board added on page 4 of the report. On page 4, after discussing the narrow focus and the accelerated process that was demanded by the legislature and the legislation, the State Board explained that a major lesson from preparation of the report is not the importance of starting with recommendations that are in the report, but instead the State Board wrote, and I quote, "The information in this report illustrates to the State Board the need for an integrated approach to management of the Delta. Best available science supports that it is important to directly address the negative effects of other stressors, including habitat, water quality, and invasive species that contribute to higher demands for water to protect public trust resources." I think that was an important note. I think it provides direction on how the board should be creating this foundation for the comprehensive review of the Bay Delta Plan. And based upon this, the San Luis Delta Mendota Water Authority requests that the questions be more foundational in nature. And by that, we have reflected questions, we've proposed questions, excuse me, in a submittal to your staff. But the questions really get to how has the ecosystem changed to the detriment of beneficial uses? What are the likely drivers of those changes? And what types of water quality regulation can and should the State Board impose to address the changes that have occurred? Again, I think presentation of these types of questions will facilitate identification of areas of agreement, disagreement, and uncertainty. And answers to these types of questions, particularly when combined with the type of report that the staff is recommending Dr. Bernstein prepare, should focus more on constructive dialogue amongst the stakeholders and allow the board to obtain information that will facilitate the development of a very integrated approach for water quality regulations in the Bay Delta. With that, I'm available to answer any questions.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Jeffrey Hsu.
Good afternoon, Chair Hoppin, members of the board. I'm Jeffrey Hsu. I'm the Water Quality Programs Coordinator for the Department of Fish and Game. I'm here on behalf of the department to express my support for the public process that you have put forward. The department appreciates the opportunity to contribute to the Delta science and to apply it for this update of the Bay Delta Plan. We also would like to let you know that we offer our experts on Delta, and to also inform you that the other fish agencies will also want to, or do, offer their experts to contribute to the panel. And thank you for your time.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Becky Sheehan.
Good afternoon, Chairman Hoppin. My name is Becky Sheehan. I'm counsel for Metropolitan Water District. I'm also here today representing the other state water contractors. The state water contractors submitted joint proposed questions jointly with the federal contractors. And you'll notice that ours are a bit more specific and targeted at issues that we think are highly relevant. And we appreciate statements that John made about, the need to have more structure and maybe have your questions be more targeted. But if you chose not to and try to be with the format as currently proposed, we also believe that our questions fall within the confines of the questions that you proposed, and we do plan on going forth and covering those subject matters. And it sounded like that you potentially agreed that your questions were broad enough to cover a broad range of issues. Also wanted to confirm and reiterate statements made by the federal contractors in regard to the flow policy report. It was on a really short timeline. We certainly appreciate the effort it took to try to get that out, but at the same time, because it was a policy document and it wasn't that kind of funky legislative process, it didn't get the kind of rigor that maybe some other documents have received. And so we probably should just take it for what it is and move forward with a discussion of the science, because it certainly does have some limitations that have been highlighted, and as we also highlighted at the time. And then moving towards the process, perhaps as staff said might be an option, there is a combination between the proposed format and the alternative format that would make some sense. For example, we very much appreciate the summary report aspect of your proposal, and having Dr. Bernstein summarize areas of agreement and disagreement. We think that would be very helpful to the board. We also appreciate and like the alternative format as far as the breaking up of interest groups into a larger range, not too many. I mean, these groups are still quite large and are representing a large number of people and interests, even in the larger groupings. And I would suggest that the groupings in the proposed format are a bit too narrow. It's, for example, unclear where the fishery agencies would go, DWR, reclamation, and even within these panels, for example, I'll just use the water users. That is a large group with very different interests because it covers the whole state. And so as you imagine, even within that group, we're going to have divergent interests. And so if you were to go with a narrower group, we would still have in our minds that even within those groups, we would have to break up time amongst the different interests along the lines of the larger groupings, just to make sure that the different interests have their opportunity to present their scientific information. And we would hope that you would leave enough time to allow that to occur. Let's see. And then as far as the invited expert panel, we share the concern of the federal contractors by calling them the invited experts, or the independent panel suggests that the rest of us are biased, when I think that everyone has their own interests and their own biases, and that sort of feeling applies to all presentations. And so we are kind of concerned about the perception issue by having such a panel, and would also ask that they be required to follow the same procedures that the rest of us would follow. So, we all are providing our information 2 weeks before, that they would be asked to do so as well. So we would have the opportunity to see what they have to say and comment on it during the workshops. So with that, I thank you.
I just have to say something. Your organization and many of the organizations that are here just implore us to use science-based decision-making. You want it science-based, and now you're saying you don't want scientists.
I don't think I'm saying that at all. I'm saying that everybody has their own personal perspectives.
Well, absolutely, but so okay.
That's all I'm saying.
Okay.
And but
So
sometimes
I
having
think we will
a
have
separate
time.
panel that we call, well, those are the scientists, and the rest of us perhaps aren't, just by inference. Not that that's the intention at all, is all that I was wanting to highlight, because of course we all have our own perspectives. Thank you.
Trip Mizell? Mr. Mizell?
afternoon, Chairman, members of the board. Trip Mizell for Department of Water Resources. The department just has a couple of brief comments to make. One, it intends on making its experts available to the board whenever you would like to take us up on that offer. But we would also request that the department be included in the panels under either format that's currently being presented by staff. Based upon the information provided in the staff's write-up, DWR prefers the alternative format, primarily because it recognizes that the department has a distinct perspective in managing the state's water resources, as opposed to the proposed format, which tends to lump us in with some very broad groups of water users or NGOs. So we would prefer the alternative format. That said, so long as there's an opportunity for the department to address its viewpoint, we feel we can work under either. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Elijah.
Good afternoon, Chair Hoppen, members of the board. David Elijah here with Downey Brand, not only representing our client group, but also Northern California Water Association and Sacramento Valley water users. I want to start off by reiterating what Mr. Rubin said, that this is an important foundational piece. And from our perspective, you've done a really good job. Your staff has done a very good job. We have some comments, of course, but we want to commend you and your staff for where you've gone. The emphasis that you are trying to place on having scientific information be the cornerstone of Phase 2 is entirely appropriate, and we think that's exactly right. We are very pleased that the way in which you've structured the questions is such that you don't want us to go back and rehash the 2009 report, the 2010 report, but instead to focus on what's happened since. And I appreciate very much, Chair Hoppen, your clarification that what we're looking for, with staff clarification, that what you're looking for is information that was not a part of those reports. It may challenge those reports, it may confirm those reports, but you're looking for additional information. That is a key point here, trying to streamline what is going to be a very compressed process. And so we appreciate that, so we can really focus on what's new and where do we go from here. Some more specific comments on the questions in the process, and then I'll talk to the biggest issue, which is the stakeholder groupings. In terms of Mr. Rubin's comments about focusing on oral presentations and areas of agreement and disagreement, we very much agree. As staff indicated, the idea of requiring written submittals and then asking scientists to summarize their submittals very quickly, identify having read the other submittals, points of agreement and points of disagreement, and lastly, why they agree or disagree. That's the key for what you would need to do. And we think that process is set up. It's not quite as explicit as it might be in the draft proposal. We think it should be clarified in the final. Similarly, this is a science-based process. It is not a time for policy statements. You have made that clear throughout this process. We support that. But the final notice needs to say that. Otherwise, we will all be sitting here listening to policy statements, and that, I think, defeats the purpose of the process you're trying to set up. As with some of the other speakers, we think that the questions your staff put together are very open-ended. We support that. They give each of the presenters the opportunity to lay out how they see these very complicated, whether it's ecosystems or water systems or hydropower systems, how they interact, how they function. And the difference in presentation, as well as the difference in the substance, I think is going to be informative to you and your staff. And that's why the open-ended nature of this is, I think, quite useful. Lastly, a point that Chair Hoppen made during the last meeting on this subject, which I think has been lost but is important, is however you allocate time, there has to be what we'll call a floating period for you and your staff to ask questions that doesn't get counted against the presentation time. That is, we believe, is going to be where the most value comes, and it's not part of the presentation. It's been what we've been talking about. We assume that that is assumed by your staff, but we want to make sure. Let me now turn to the question of stakeholders. And Chair Hoppen, appreciate very much your suggestion that there be some sort of hybrid between the two proposals. We think you've hired, don't have, frankly, any experience with Mr. Bernstein. He came recommended highly, but we had not worked with him. At the June 1st workshop, we think he did a very, very good job in moderating the different opinions, making sure everyone was heard, and trying to move the group towards consensus. And we're very heartened by him as a facilitator. We think that you've hired someone who's good, and you ought to let him sort of run this process for you. And therefore, we would prefer the alternative proposal with a tweak. The concern of having experts is an entirely legitimate one. We believe that if you have all of the agencies, all the water users, et cetera, submit the names of the individuals they would have testify a reasonable time ahead of the workshops, maybe 3 weeks rather than 2 weeks. Mr. Bernstein certainly would be able to canvass and see whether there are the experts who are going to be testifying. Our suspicion is that all of those experts are going to be lined up to testify anyhow, and therefore it's not necessary to have a separate panel. They'll all be here anyhow. This is going to be the place for all Bay Delta experts this summer and fall. As importantly, however, we need to make sure that those experts are given the time they need to prepare. And so there's going to be an adjustment in terms of scheduling how you work that. One of the things we're afraid of, frankly, is the board was very careful to schedule these workshops so it would not interfere with staff's effort to actually do the environmental document and everything else. We think you need to keep to that schedule, frankly. And that's why this hybrid approach would be useful. It would not delay the process. We think we need to get to conclusion so that staff has the information it needs, because that's the goal. Lastly, one of the questions staff has raised has to do with the participation of others in the process. We think that the process that has been suggested, wherein individuals that don't fit neatly into one of these categories can make written statements and participate through a public comment type of process, that'll work very well. There are probably, there are not that many agencies that fit into that category, and therefore your board always makes time for individuals to have their say, as you are doing this afternoon, and we think that we can trust you to do that again. So if you have any questions, be glad to answer them, but overall we think this is a very good process with these slight changes, picking the alternative process, but allowing Mr. Bernstein to make sure that there are sufficient experts to have a wide range of discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Brett Baker.
Thank you, Chair Hoppen and board members. Mr. Moore, it's good to see you here today, and I'm here today commenting on behalf of Central and South Delta Water Agency. We apologize for not submitting written comment. It was something that slipped beneath our radar. And just wanted to touch on your comments from the previous agenda item, Vice Chair. We believe that perhaps there may be a better way to do these processes. We don't want to reinvent the wheel, of course. It's not something, there's not going to be a horrible amount of new or groundbreaking information, we don't suppose, so really applaud you on doing the work on the front end to try and get the formatting correct. So I was sent here today to do two things. Well, actually, to not do one thing, which was make you mad, was my boss told me. He said he gets paid to do that, so that was Mr. Nomalini. And then the next thing was to encourage you to to remind you that we will be stating our opposition to any degradation of water quality in the Delta, any of the changing of existing requirements, but to also say that we believe there are some changes that can occur within the Delta, perhaps physically, that would result in both ecosystem and water supply improvements. And I would like to suggest that that possibly be a one section of the working group or a working group in and of its own. I think that looking at physical improvements to the existing system, conveying water through the Delta would be beneficial to a lot of folks and wouldn't cost us extra water. So if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them, and we'd be happy to stay engaged with the process as it goes forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Baker. Ms. Kincaid.
Good afternoon, Chair Hoppen, board members, welcome. Board Member Moore. I'm Valerie Kincaid on behalf of the San Joaquin Tributaries Authority. I'd like to echo the positive sentiments about the process on Phase 2. I think that so far it's been developed really well. I agree at the workshop, Dr. Bernstein's handling of all folks from different points of view I was very impressed with. So I have high hopes for the facilitator. The SJTA does have a couple comments about the process. We definitely support the alternate format over the proposed. And despite the previous tension about the independent expert panel, I unfortunately am going to weigh in on that as well. And I think that really Charlie's comments earlier about how he would approach an independent expert panel make me feel a lot better, frankly, about having a panel like that. I do still have maybe an overly technical issue with the name, and frankly, I think the real issue here is that we don't want a panel of folks that are being called independent experts to come at a higher level or above other experts and influence the authority of the board to make a scientific decision and to hear the science. So I think as long as that's not happening, I agree with Mr. Elijam that certainly this is going to be the place for all Delta experts. To the extent that there can be an independent panel put together, I am a little skeptical that could exist, but maybe some creative name other than independent expert would be appropriate. I don't have any suggestions right now.
Can we just call them other experts? Because really that's what they are. They're just other experts. They're not associated with
If I may, actually, if we misspoke, I apologize, but we did call it the invited expert panel, recognizing that there's people that might have some knowledge that might not otherwise participate in our function, so we're inviting them.
Valerie, so you know, in one staff meeting, I referred to them as UC Davis types, and Miss Evoy hasn't smiled at me since then, so I have to be a little careful about what I want to call them as well. But
well, and clearly, as you well know from being at that workshop, on the workshop, it was a
we'll figure out some way. We'll figure out some way of calling them something with respect that doesn't give them any particular superior status. Okay. Okay.
I think we're on
I don't
board
have
with
any
that.
idea what it's going to be, and the suggestion probably won't come from me.
Okay, and I think that's important. As I mentioned earlier, the authority of the board is what we're focused on, and we wouldn't want that to be compromised or questioned by any title that gave anyone more emphasis than they deserve.
All right.
Gotcha. The second point that the SJTA would like to make is on the proposed or the alternate format. We do support. However, we support that with a tweak of including a San Joaquin River water user panel. My understanding from staff communication and the facilitator communication is that San Joaquin folks were not included because they're not going to be on the chopping block in phase 2. And as tempting as that may be to take up, the notice of preparation and other documents so far have not made that clear. So without being extremely assured of that scenario, we certainly want to participate in the workshop and would like a place at the table, not only for the lack of assurances that we won't be regulated, but also because, as the board well knows, in phase 1, we have not been provided the opportunity for workshops, and we certainly would appreciate the opportunity to come in at phase 2, provide information, and have that incorporated into our phase 1. So
you'd like to kind of like be the San Joaquin Tributaries Authority experts or something?
The independent San Joaquin Tributaries expert panel is what you could call us. If it works for you, that works for us. And then just one quick comment on Charlie's earlier question of how to arrange stakeholders. And I think what came to my mind when you were asking that question was certainly that this process, because of timing and other issues, is different than most. And in usual board processes that have more time, you have everyone provide a notice of intent that is going to participate in the process, and then you organize by stakeholder group from there. So, you know, because of the timing, I don't know if there's any solution, but it does feel like we're putting the cart before the horse. We're trying to arrange stakeholder groups without actually knowing who's going to be there to weigh in. I don't know if we could require an NOI submittal quickly, and that might fine-tune the process, but certainly that's something that I thought of when you brought up that issue. So, thank you, and if you have any other questions, let me know. Thanks.
Thank you, Valerie. That takes care of our speakers, unless Ms. Townsend has some surprises for us. Questions of staff on either side of the podium? Mr. Howard, you suggested getting together on a rather short time frame here, which is fine with us. How do you want to kind of debrief with individual board members? And
well, that's a possibility, though. You know,
here comes the surprise lady. You do that intentionally, don't you? You know I can't say anything mean to you. Linda Dorn.
Good afternoon, Chair Hoppen, board members. Thanks for letting me speak, and I'd like to say we appreciate being able to participate in this process. We attended the June 1st meeting and also submitted comments, so I won't say anything more about those. But I did want to, I guess, not only be the surprise speaker at the end, but be one that prefers the proposed format. And I'm sorry, I didn't say Linda Dormer, Sacramento Regional County Sanitation District. Maybe that will explain some of the surprise. And the main reason why we prefer the proposed format is the expert panel. We think that that's a good way to organize the workshops. And if you are going to do this hybrid approach, one of the things that we would like to see to include some of the other stakeholders that maybe have a more specific issue or bent is to include a panel called In Delta Interests. Right now, under the alternative format, it's included as a stakeholder panel of In Delta water suppliers or water supplies. So the recommendation that we would have is, if you do a hybrid, is to include an In Delta Interests panel also. And then there was one thing that was brought up in the June 1st meeting that I wanted to make certain that all the board members had heard, which was the idea of holding a 5th workshop that has to do with balancing that the Water Board must do eventually in the update of the Bay Delta Plan. And we would encourage you all to think about having a 5th workshop after the first 4 to allow stakeholders to weigh in that area too. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. With that, Mr. Howard.
It seems as though the dilemma we have is that we're proposing to hold these workshops on one day, and there's a lot of information that people want to provide, and you know, trying to squeeze in the various groups certainly can be done. It just requires us to therefore decrease the amount of time that they have to summarize their interest to the board. After listening to the discussion here and assuming that we could actually, that it wouldn't be unreasonable to simply have stakeholder groups but have limited time for them to talk, one alternative that I'd propose to the board is that we do an expert panel. We arrange it for 1 to 2 hours, I'm not quite sure which, in that we do the 6 stakeholder groups as well, but we give them each half an hour. And that should be, I think, since the principal information they're conveying is written, that should be enough time for them to summarize what they have to say and anything they think are major areas of disagreement. You're not going to get an expert panel, a panel of stakeholders that comes in with 5 or 6 experts and able to present a, you know, detailed analysis of various elements of this issue, because there's simply not going to be the time to do it. So we either do something like that or we expand this into a multi-day process for each of these topics. I don't think that because of the fact that this is written material that there's really a need to go to a multi-day process. So at this point, I think I'd recommend to you that we do an expert panel. We do 6 panels. We limit them to half an hour for, and that is, that would be 5 hours. Then I'm sure there'll be lots of questions for another hour or 2, and then that would give us another hour or more for public comment. And that would eat up a full day. So that's an option that hasn't been discussed yet, but that at least we're not, you know, I think we're giving everyone a fair chance to summarize their, of all the principal interest groups, to summarize their issues and concerns. And as I said, they go into as much detail as they want and they're written.
From the perspective of Mr. Rubin and Elijah and Ms. Kincaid and others, can you articulate, with the understanding that you have ample opportunity to provide written comments that we certainly read and digest, can you articulate yourselves, given the fact that you will have plenty of time for questions in a half an hour? I mean, we had requests anywhere from an hour to an hour and a half on the original proposal. Certainly not anyone's intention to try and limit what you provide to us. It's a matter of trying to fit this into some type of a criteria or time frame. Any comments? Valerie?
Actually,
your doctor says the exercise is good for you, so don't.
As Valerie's coming up, let me just say that just for me, conciseness in making verbal comments is always good. I'm sometimes confused by people who ask for an hour, 2 hours to provide, you know, verbal comments and testimony. Just for me, if you can't capture something concisely in a 10, 15 minutes, you know, even 5 interval, referring to your written comments, an hour of talking at me is not at all helpful. So actually, like Tom's suggestion, because it leaves us, you know, with plenty of room for additional dialogues and questioning, it almost forces people to be concise and refer to their written submissions, which allows us the opportunity to also refer to them as well. So, you know, keep that in mind. I know that it's always is, I guess, human nature to ask for more time, but just from my perspective, more is not necessarily better.
And I agree. I certainly think that the affirmative, or that's how I think of them, presentations, and the recitation of the material we submit 2 weeks ahead should not take even a half hour. I mean, it depends on how many experts you have. It depends on how much testimony and that kind of thing. If you have a couple different experts, I could see, you know, a few people taking a half hour. But what I think personally is going to be the most valuable to the board aspect of the presentations is after reviewing everyone else's material and distinguishing why your science either agrees with or is different than someone else's science or is a derivation thereof. Personally, I think that's the most important part of this. It touches on the concept that the facilitator is then going to do a report that highlights really where the rubber meets the road, the crux of the question for the board. And it does concern me that that could be done, that you could review your affirmative materials and then provide, I wouldn't call it a rebuttal, certainly, but here's why the other folks are wrong and I'm right. I don't know if we can do that in a half hour. I think that's the most important part of the presentations as I see them. Perhaps John's suggestion of working closely with the facilitator on the back end and making sure the facilitator's report has all of that correct, which would be able to shorten timeframes in the workshop. But I certainly think a half hour, it does make me a little nervous that you would get that all right, the affirmative presentation and the differences all at one time. But I'll let other folks comment. That's my gut reaction.
Thank you. John?
I think that
remembering that you were the one that wanted an hour and a half.
That's true, and the hour and a half was proposed by the San Luis Delta Mendota Water Authority state water contractors, representing a vast number of people and farmers that farm a vast amount of land. But kind of getting to the crux of this issue, obviously we'll work within whatever time we're provided, but we are dealing with extremely important issues, very complex issues, dealing with a number of species. And as I said in my initial presentation to the board, I don't think the board should ask any of the participants to spend much time summarizing their written comments. I mean, that's our job, to prepare them in a way so that when you're reading them ahead of the workshop, you're digesting the information. But because of the complexity of these issues, identifying areas of agreement, disagreement, uncertainty is critical, and that's going to take time. You think about the challenges before us. You're going to have a workshop on changes to the ecosystem in the low salinity zone. What changes have occurred? Physical changes, chemical changes, biological changes. Are there areas of agreement, disagreement? What caused those changes? What do people think caused those changes? What does the science say? I mean, it's an incredible amount of information, and you compound that with the current process. From the stakeholders' perspective, you're holding 4 workshops, and then things kind of go dark, and your staff prepares some reports, and then those come out 4 months, 5 months later. We'll have an opportunity to comment on those drafts, but at that point, a lot of the thinking solidified. This is our opportunity to talk with the board members and all of your staff about our concerns on issues that are incredibly important. And we don't have an opportunity to do this very often. You think about where we are. We're looking at reviewing a 2006 water quality control plan that is substantially similar to a 1995 water quality control plan. A major review, what's being proposed to you, has incredible ramifications. And if it takes 2 days to get through this and give the stakeholders an hour and a half, I don't think that's unreasonable.
Thank you, John. Becky? Ms. Sheehan? Just because David's sitting in front of you doesn't mean he has to go first.
Ladies first. I was meaning to be behind David. I didn't mean to take cuts.
I make it a point to be polite once during every board meeting. You just got it.
Oh, I'm lucky. Thank you. I totally agree with everything John said. The only other point that I might add is because we are being lumped into fairly large groups with disparate interests, you know, even if we are all water users, we certainly have different interests, that just giving a half an hour really does constrain things. After you break up the time within your group, you may only have 10 minutes or 15 minutes. And I would argue with such a complex issue, that would be very difficult. So, thank you.
Thank you. David?
Very briefly, I think our preference would be for an expansion of time. We understand that that does not fit with the board schedule, so we'll work within one day. In terms of the presentations, we would be glad to dispense with all summary of evidence. That should be written. Again, the value is going to be the agreement, disagreement, and why. That's going to be very difficult to do in a half an hour. We proposed an hour. We think that's doable. We also think that the invited expert panel, or whatever we're going to call them, needs to have the same amount of time because, as I believe staff said early on, they would be subject to the same sort of pre-submittal and requirements as anyone else. In that way, as Mr. Howard identified, there would be plenty of time for the board members to ask questions. And again, that's the value of this process. Thank you.
I would, what about invited science panel? We just make the assumption that.
But everyone's invited.
Right, exactly. Well, the science panel. And I'm not sure if does that include the fisheries agencies, the regulatory agencies, or is it academic scientists that we're talking about?
We were thinking, because we've had some very preliminary discussions with Dr. Peter Goodwin of the Delta Science Program, and it would really be left to him, given the questions, to find experts. And that's something that we might assist him if you request assist him, but it's something that would be like, well, here you pose the questions. This is something that would be mostly left up to him, and they might vary them between the various workshops.
Well, if that's the case, one area that was brought up in some of the stakeholder submittals was and one example was how do we balance between creating wetland habitat and a methyl mercury water quality